Hello and welcome to a new episode of Couch Developer. Today I'm going to discuss promises in Node.js. I'm going to look into exactly what they are and how you can use them. Let's first talk about what they are, right? For that, we need to look at asynchronous code, and here we have a very basic example of that. We don't care about what it does, but what we care about instead is the structure of the code, because promises don't solve anything other than how to structure your asynchronous code. That's it. So if you look at the code, you can see a quick and simple example of how your callback-based code is simplified, because that is what one of the benefits of using promises, into a promise-based structure. In regards to the structure, the first one simply sets up a callback to the call to be called, by your asynchronous function once it's done, right? While on the right side, you get the same effect. Your first line executes the asynchronous function, and the second one simply sets up the callbacks, one for the success and one for the error. Now let's look at a life cycle of a promise. Your asynchronous code and your promise are bound together. So when the first one finishes, it'll either succeed or it will fail, right? If it does succeed, then your promise will be resolved. If it doesn't, then it'll be rejected. In practice, what this means is one of the two callbacks you set up earlier will be called, depending on the final status. So let's look at how we would write a simple promise to read a file, okay? Let's first require the correct module. Oops. And now let's create a promise with the function reject, and then let's just read the file. Let's just read this file, for instance, and the actual callback, because read file is a method that receives a callback. It's not a promise based method by default. And we can get the error and the content of the file. Now we just do it simple. If there is an error, then we just cut the flow here, rejecting the promise with the error. Otherwise, we just resolve it with the content to string to make sure that we actually get the string representation and not the buffer. Now we just do promise, then console log, and catch console error. This is a very basic example, but what it does is it should read the file, and once the callback is called, once the file is read and we have the content, we will either call whatever method or whatever function we define as a callback using the then method, or if there's an error, we will call whatever function or method we set up using the catch method. So let's save it and execute it. This one, and as you can see, we do get the code of the file that we wanted to read. Now when you execute the code, you get what you would expect. Your code writes the content of the file to standard output, but let's comment out the last line where we think we're executing the code. So let's comment this line out, save it, but for the sake of this test, let's also add a new line here. Execute it. And let's try it out. As you can see, your code is still being executed. You can't queue anything up to it like we did at the end, but it's still reading the file. That is because promises start executing the code as soon as they are defined. This is important to remember when you're structuring your code. If instead we were to wrap the promise in a function that actually returns it, then we will get control over when to execute it as well as to when to queue anything up to it. So let me show you. If we were to do a function here that returns this code, and then we were to call it this way, we need to add parentheses because now P is actually a function. Oops. If we are to execute this, we should get the same result, right? We get the executed because we didn't remove that, and we get the content of the file. Now we get control over when this code is executed. Let's now assume that you want to change your callback-based code into a promise-based structure. You don't have to go around wrapping your functions one by one. You can always take this approach and create a new function that will do the job for you. Let's call it a promisify function. Promisify, which will only receive your function, your callback-based function, as a parameter, and will return a new function instead that will override basically and will let you use a promise-based approach. So let's simply get the arguments dynamically in the form of an array. And now let's return the new promise with the good old parameters reject. And now the logic for this promise will be to add an extra parameter to the ones we already have, which will be the callback function you're not using anymore. You don't need it, but you still your original function needs it. So we need to add it, a custom one. So we'll add a new one, which assumes you only get one result as a return and the error as a first parameter. You can change this to suit whatever standard you use for your callbacks, but you should be using one. So after that, what this callback function will do is simply what we did above, simply return and reject the promise if there is an error, or resolve it with the results. And now we call the function. Oops, that's a null, just to make sure, and we pass in the arguments. So what we're doing here is we're grabbing all the arguments that you would originally send to your callback-based function, but you're now not needing a callback. So the last parameter, you won't need it, so we add it manually with a custom callback. So now your promisify function is ready. Now we can test, for instance, promisifying. Instead of doing p read our file, we can actually promisify the read file method. So we can do a p reader promisify first read file. Read file, like I said before, it's a promise. It's a callback based method, so it requires a callback to be passed as the last argument. What we're doing here is we're removing that need, and now we can remove this and do preader and pass in the argument we would otherwise pass to read file. So test1.js. So just for the sake of completeness, we'll test comment out this code, and if we test it, as you can see, we actually get the buffer, the content of the read file method. If we wanted to turn that into string, we don't have a way to get into the code of read file to do that, but we can easily add a new step into the queue app method here. Let me just structure this a bit nicer to read, and then we can just add a pre-step here, which will be a function that will receive the content and return string version of it. That's it. Now if we test it out, as you can see, you get the string content of the file that we're reading, then we'll print it out into standard output. Of course, the promisify function is something that it's already provided by the util module, as you probably saw earlier in my autocomplete. So you can simply require it and use that method instead. Let me show you. We can say const promisify. We just want that from the util right now. Whoop. And instead of using our own version, we just leave it at that. So we have everything commented out, but the code that uses the promisify function, and then the promise being executed. And now if we execute the code, whoops, promisify, there you go, promisify, sorry about that. If we execute, the actual code works, and you can see how such an approach like the promisify util being provided by Node natively can be easily created here. That's it for today's video. I hope that you are now ready to go out and start using promises and avoiding the callback hell in your code. If you have any questions, please do leave them down below as a comment, and I'll make sure to answer them as soon as possible. Otherwise, please remember to share and subscribe for more content like this. See you on the next one. Thank you very much.